Jake Morrison had dreamed of visiting London since he was 12 years old. Watching documentaries about the Tower of London and Buckingham Palace on the small television in his family's cramped apartment in Detroit. Now at 28, he finally had enough money saved from his job at the auto parts factory to make the trip happen. 3 years of working double shifts, skipping nights out with friends, and eating ramen noodles for dinner had led to this moment. The flight from Detroit to London had been his first time on an airplane, and Jake spent most of the 8 hours pressed against the window, watching the world shrink below him. He carried a worn backpack filled with guidebooks he had borrowed from the library, each one marked with sticky notes and highlighted passages about the places he absolutely had. To see his first morning in London was gray and drizzling, but Jake couldn't have been more excited. He had booked a small room in a budget hostel near King's Cross Station, and the narrow bed with its scratchy sheets felt like luxury compared to the couch he had been sleeping on back home. While saving money for this trip, Jake's plan was simple. Hit all the major tourist attractions, take as many photos as possible, and soak up every moment of this once-in-a-lifetime experience. He had calculated that if he was careful with his money, he could make his savings last for exactly 10 days before he had to fly back to Detroit, and return to his routine life at the factory. Buckingham Palace was at the top of his list, and he arrived there just after 9 in the morning, joining the growing crowd of tourists gathering outside the famous gates. The palace looked exactly like it did in all the photographs he had studied. But seeing it in person gave Jake a thrill that surprised him with its intensity. He spent the first hour simply walking around the perimeter, taking pictures from every angle he could manage. The other tourists seemed more sophisticated than Jake, with their expensive cameras and designer luggage, but he didn't let that dampen his enthusiasm. This was his dream trip, and he was determined to enjoy every second of it. That's when Jake first noticed the royal guards. He had read about them in his guidebooks, of course, but seeing them in person was something else entirely. They stood perfectly still in their red uniforms and tall black hats, their faces completely expressionless, their eyes staring straight ahead, as if the crowds of tourists surrounding them didn't exist at all. Jake was fascinated by their discipline. How did they manage to stand so still for so long? How did they resist the urge to smile or react when tourists waved at them or tried to get their attention? He found himself staring at one guard in particular, a young man who looked to be about Jake's age, with sharp features and an impressively stoic expression as the morning progressed. Jake watched other tourists try various tactics to get reactions from the guards. Some people waved enthusiastically, others made funny faces, and a few even tried talking to them directly. The guards never responded, never moved, never acknowledged the attention in any way. It was like they were statues rather than real people. Jake's competitive nature, the same trait that had helped him work those grueling double shifts to save for this trip, began to kick in. Surely there was some way to get at least a small reaction from one of these guards, if not anything disrespectful or inappropriate. Just a tiny acknowledgement that there was a real person underneath that impressive uniform. He started small, positioning himself directly in the guard's line of sight and offering a friendly wave. Nothing. He tried a big smile and a thumbs up. Still nothing. The guard's eyes remained fixed on some invisible point in the distance, its expression as unchanging as carved stone. Other tourists began to notice Jake's efforts, and some of them started encouraging him. A family from Australia suggested he try making a funny face. A group of college students from Germany recommended jumping up and down. Jake found himself becoming the center of a small crowd of people, who were all invested in his mission to get some kind of response from the guard. Attention was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Back home in Detroit, he was just another factory worker, invisible in the crowd of people trying to make ends meet. But here, in front of Buckingham Palace, he was entertaining a growing audience of international tourists who were cheering him on and offering suggestions. Jake escalated his efforts gradually. He started doing a little dance, moving from side to side while keeping his eyes locked on the guard's face. The crowd behind him giggled and applauded, and Jake felt a rush of confidence he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he was the center of attention. and people were actually enjoying his performance. The guard, whose name tag read Thompson, remained completely unmoved. His posture was perfect, his gaze steady, his face showing no emotion whatsoever. If anything, his complete lack of reaction made Jake more determined to succeed. "Come on, mate," Jake called out, using what he thought was a British accent. "Just a little smile. I've come all the way from America to see you guys." The crowd laughed at Jake's attempt at the accent, and someone behind him shouted, "Try doing an impression of the Queen." Jake, emboldened by the laughter and encouragement, began to walk back and forth in front of the guard, mimicking what he imagined was a royal wave. He held his hand up and moved it in the slow, precise manner he had seen in videos of the Queen. "Greeting crowds. Good morning, my subjects," Jake announced in his exaggerated British accent. "We are most pleased to visit our palace today." The crowd was eating it up, laughing and taking videos of Jake's performance. Felt like a comedian. Like an entertainer. Like someone special. The factory back in Detroit seemed like a million miles away from this moment of pure joy and connection with people from all over the world. But guard Thompson continued to stare straight ahead, his face betraying nothing. Jake realized he was going to have to try something bigger, something more creative, if he wanted to crack that impressive facade of professional discipline. Jake's audience had grown to nearly 30 people. It's a mix of tourists from different countries who had stopped their own sightseeing to watch his increasingly elaborate attempts to get a reaction from guard Thompson. The encouragement from the crowd was intoxicating for someone who had spent most of his life blending into the background. "Try singing to him," suggested a woman with a thick southern accent who was clearly American like Jake. Guards are still human, right? Everyone likes music. Jake grinned and cleared his throat dramatically. He'd never been much of a singer, but the energy of the crowd was making him feel bold and confident. He began singing "My Girl" by The Temptations, one of his favorite songs from his father's old record collection. Directing his performance entirely toward guard Thompson, the crowd clapped along, and several people started recording videos on their phones. Jake felt like he was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He added dance moves, spinning and sliding across the pavement in front of the guard post, his voice carrying across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Guard Thompson's expression remained completely neutral. His eyes stayed fixed on that same invisible point in the distance, his posture perfect, his face showing no awareness that Jake existed at all. The complete lack of response only fueled Jake's determination to try harder. "He's like a robot," laughed a teenager from the crowd. "There's no way he's real." Jake decided to test that theory. He began moving closer to guard Thompson, staying just outside what he assumed was an appropriate distance, but close enough to study the guard's face for any tiny sign of human reaction. He could see the guard's chest rising and falling with his breathing, could see the occasional blink of his eyes, but nothing else showed that he was aware of Jake's presence. "I bet he wants to laugh," Jake announced to his audience. "Look at his eyes. I think I can see him fighting back a smile." This was pure wishful thinking on Jake's part, but the crowd seemed to buy it, leaning in closer to examine guard Thompson's face for any sign of cracking composure. Jake felt like a tour guide, pointing out details about the guard's uniform and speculating about what he might be thinking. The performance had been going on for nearly an hour. When Jake decided to attempt his most ambitious stunt yet, he had noticed that there was a small barrier rope near the guard post, probably meant to keep tourists at a respectful distance. Jake figured that if he could step just slightly over that rope, maybe the proximity would finally force some kind of reaction from guard Thompson. "Watch this, everyone," Jake announced to his audience. "I'm going to get right up close and see if he'll finally acknowledge me." Several people in the crowd called out warnings, suggesting that maybe Jake was pushing things too far, but others encouraged him to go for it. The attention and excitement were like a drug to Jake, who had never experienced anything like this level of public engagement. Jake stepped carefully over the rope barrier, moving slowly and deliberately to show that he meant no harm or disrespect. He was now standing directly in front of guard Thompson, close enough to see the fine details of his uniform, the precise way his rifle was positioned, and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Hello there," Jake said softly, speaking directly to the guard for the first time. "I know you can't respond, but I just want you to know that I think what you do is really impressive." I could never stand that still for so long. For just a moment. Jake thought he saw something flicker in Guard Thompson's eyes. It might have been his imagination, but it seemed like the guard's gaze shifted slightly, just enough to actually focus on Jake's face instead of staring through him, encouraged by what he thought might have been progress. I'm from Detroit, in America. I saved up for 3 years to make this trip, and seeing you guys has been one of the highlights. The discipline you show is incredible. The crowd behind Jake had grown quieter, sensing that something different was happening. Some of them were still recording, but the mood had shifted from playful entertainment to something more serious and intimate. Guard Thompson's breathing seemed to change slightly, coming just a little deeper and more controlled. Jake was standing, close enough now to see that the guard was actually quite young. He was probably close to Jake's own age. With clear skin and bright eyes that held intelligence and awareness despite his stoic expression. I bet you have a story, Jake continued, his voice taking on a more conversational tone. Yeah. I bet you have family and friends and dreams just like everyone else. This job must be really challenging, but you do it with such dignity. That's when Jake made a decision that would change everything, instead of continuing to try to get a reaction for the entertainment of the crowd. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small American flag pin that he had brought from home. It was something his father had given him before he died. A tiny symbol of pride that Jake had planned to leave at some significant location during his trip. I want to give you something, Jake said quietly, holding up the pin so Guard Thompson could see it. It's not much, but it's from my dad. He always taught me to respect people who serve their country, no matter which country it is. Jake placed the small pin on the ground directly in front of Guard Thompson's feet, then stepped back respectfully. The crowd behind him had gone completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something meaningful rather than just a tourist stunt. For the first time since Jake had begun his performance, Guard Thompson's eyes moved. They dropped down to look at the small American flag pin on the ground, then rose back up to meet Jake's gaze directly. The look lasted only a few seconds, but it was unmistakably a moment of human connection between two young men from different countries who understood respect and honor. Guard Thompson's lips moved almost imperceptibly, forming what might have been the words "thank you," though no sound came out. Then his gaze returned to that distant point, and his expression became neutral once again. But Jake had seen it. The crowd had seen it. Something real and meaningful had just happened. Something far more significant than the silly performance that had started this whole interaction. The moment of silent communication between Jake and Guard Thompson seemed to hang in the air like something sacred. The crowd behind Jake remained unusually quiet, as if they too had witnessed something far more profound than they had expected. When they stopped to watch a tourist trying to make a guard smile, Jake stepped back from the guard post, suddenly feeling self-conscious about the spectacle he had created. What had started as a playful attempt to get a reaction had transformed into something much more personal and meaningful. He looked at the small American flag pin lying on the ground near Guard Thompson's feet and felt a complex mix of emotions. He couldn't quite identify. "That was beautiful, mate," said a middle-aged British man who had been watching from the back of the crowd. "You turned something silly into something respectful. Your father would be proud." Other members of the crowd began to disperse, but several people approached Jake to shake his hand or pat him on the back. They seemed to understand that they had witnessed a moment of genuine human connection that transcended the usual tourist attraction dynamic. Jake was preparing to leave when he heard a commotion near the guard post. Another guard, this one clearly. A supervisor, based on the additional insignia on his uniform, was approaching Guard Thompson. Jake's heart sank, worried that his interaction had gotten the young guard in trouble. The supervisor, whose name tag identified him as Sergeant Williams, walked directly to where the American flag pin lay on the ground. He bent down, picked it up, and examined it carefully. Then he looked at Guard Thompson with an expression that Jake couldn't read from his position several yards away. Jake watched anxiously as Sergeant Williams and Guard Thompson had what appeared to be a brief, quiet conversation. The supervisor was clearly asking questions, and Guard Thompson was responding with barely perceptible nods and what looked like whispered answers. After a few minutes, Sergeant Williams turned and walked directly toward Jake, who was still standing. With the remaining members of his impromptu audience, Jake's stomach dropped, certain that he was about to be reprimanded, or possibly even arrested, for disturbing a royal guard. "Are you the American gentleman who left this pin?" Sergeant Williams asked, holding up the small flag. "Yes, sir," Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry if I caused any problems. I didn't mean any disrespect." Sergeant Williams studied Jake's face carefully, and Jake was surprised to see that the supervisor didn't look angry. If anything, his expression seemed thoughtful and perhaps even slightly moved. "Guard Thompson told me what you said to him," Sergeant Williams said, "about your father and about respecting those who serve their country." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak without his voice breaking. The mention of his father always affected him deeply, especially in emotional situations like this one. "Guard Thompson has been having a difficult time lately," Sergeant Williams continued, speaking quietly enough that only Jake and a few nearby tourists could hear. "He lost his own father recently, and he's been struggling with the discipline required for this position while dealing with his grief." Jake felt his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. He had been so focused on his own entertainment and the crowd's reaction that he hadn't considered that Guard Thompson might be dealing with personal struggles of his own. "Your gesture and your words reminded him why he chose this job," Sergeant Williams said. "It reminded him that what we do here matters, that it represents something larger than ourselves." The supervisor looked down at the small American flag pin in his hand. "Guard Thompson asked me to return this to you, but he also asked me to give you something in return." Sergeant Williams reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pin bearing the insignia of the Queen's Guard. It was clearly an official piece, something that would normally only be given to members of the unit or perhaps two dignitaries and important visitors. "This is from Guard Thompson's personal collection," Sergeant Williams explained. "He wants you to have it as a token of respect between two men who understand what it means to honor their fathers and their countries." Jake stared at the pin in amazement. This was far beyond anything he had expected when he started his playful attempt to get a reaction from the guard. He looked over at Guard Thompson, who was still standing at perfect attention. But Jake could swear he saw the slightest nod of acknowledgement. "I don't know what to say," Jake managed. "This is incredible." "Guard Thompson also asked me to tell you something," Sergeant Williams continued. "He said that your father raised a son who knows how to show respect, even while having fun. And that's a rare quality in today's world." The few remaining tourists who had heard this exchange began applauding softly, and Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes. This simple interaction had become one of the most meaningful experiences of his entire life. Sergeant Williams handed Jake both pins, his father's American flag and the Queen's Guard insignia. "Guard Thompson's shift ends in an hour," he said. "If you'd like to meet him properly and perhaps share a cup of tea, he asked me to tell you that he'll be at the cafe just outside the palace gates." Jake looked back at Guard Thompson one more time. The young guard was still maintaining his perfect military bearing. But there was something different about his posture now. He seemed more confident, more grounded, as if Jake's gesture had somehow helped him reconnect with his sense of purpose. "I'll be there," Jake said to Sergeant Williams. "And thank you for letting me know about his father. I'm sorry for his loss." As Jake walked away from Buckingham Palace, clutching the two pins in his hand, he realized that his silly tourist stunt had accidentally created exactly the kind of meaningful connection he had been hoping to find during his trip to London. Sometimes the best experiences come not from following guidebooks and taking pictures, but from genuine human moments that remind us that we're all more alike than different, regardless of which country we call home. Jake spent the next hour wandering around the area near Buckingham Palace, his mind racing with thoughts about what had just happened. He kept looking at the two pins in his hand, his father's American flag and the Queen's Guard insignia, hardly believing that a simple tourist adventure had led to such an unexpected exchange. The cafe that Sergeant Williams had mentioned was a small, cozy place called the Crown's Rest, tucked between a souvenir shop and a bookstore just outside the palace gates. Jake arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table near the window where he could watch for Guard Thompson. He ordered a cup of tea, trying to embrace the British experience fully. though he wasn't sure he was drinking it correctly. As the appointed time approached, Jake found himself growing nervous. What would they talk about? Would the guard be different? Out of uniform. Had Jake built up this meeting in his mind to be more significant than it actually was? At exactly the promised time, a young man entered the cafe. Jake immediately recognized him as Guard Thompson, despite the dramatic change in his appearance. Out of his red uniform and tall black hat, he looked like any other young man in his 20s, wearing jeans and a casual button-down shirt, but Jake recognized those same intelligent eyes and the strong jawline that had remained so stoic during their earlier encounter. Guard Thompson spotted Jake immediately and approached his table with a slight smile, the first facial expression. Jake had seen from him all day. "You must be Jake from Detroit," he said, extending his hand. His voice carried a crisp English accent, but it was warm and friendly rather than formal. "I'm David Thompson. Thank you for waiting." Jake stood and shook David's hand, surprised by how normal and approachable he seemed outside of his official role. "Thank you for meeting me. Still can't believe what happened back there." David sat down across from Jake and signaled the waitress for his own cup of tea. "I have to admit, when you first started your performance this morning, I thought you were just another tourist looking for a laugh at our expense." "I was," Jake admitted sheepishly. "I'm embarrassed about that now. I was just trying to entertain the crowd and maybe get a funny photo for my friends back home." "But then something changed," David continued. "The way you spoke to me, the respect you showed, and especially when you mentioned your father. That wasn't about entertaining anyone else. That was real." Jake nodded, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that always came when he thought about his dad. "My father died 2 years ago. He was a veteran, served in Vietnam. He always taught me to respect people in uniform, no matter what country they served." David's expression grew more serious. "Sergeant Williams told you about my father, didn't he? He mentioned that you'd lost him recently." "I'm really sorry for your loss." David stared down at his tea for a moment. "He died 3 months ago. Heart attack. Completely unexpected. He was the one who inspired me to join the Queen's Guard. He served in the military when he was young, and he always talked about the honor and discipline it required." Jake could hear the pain in David's voice and recognized it immediately. "It's hard, isn't it? Trying to honor their memory while dealing with the grief?" "Exactly," David said, looking up at Jake with surprise. "Some days I stand at that post, and I feel connected to something larger than myself, something my father would be proud of. But other days, especially lately, I just feel empty and alone, going through the motions." Jake understood completely. "After my dad died, I threw myself into work, saving money for this trip. I thought if I could accomplish something he would have been proud of, it would help with the grief. But some days it just felt pointless." The two young men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each recognizing in the other someone who understood a loss and the struggle to find meaning in its aftermath. "When you placed that pin at my feet and talked about your father," David continued, "it reminded me why I chose this job. It's not about standing perfectly still or ignoring tourists. It's about representing something bigger than myself, something that connects me to my father's values and to the history of my country." Jake smiled. "Your father would be proud of you. The discipline you showed today was incredible. I could never do what you do." "You'd be surprised what you can do when you're honoring someone you love," David replied. "Your father raised you to show respect even while having fun. That's not easy to balance." The conversation continued for over an hour, with both men sharing stories about their fathers, their struggles with grief, and their hopes for the future. Jake learned that David was 26, had studied literature at university, and had joined the Queen's Guard partly to follow in his father's military footsteps and partly to find some structure and purpose while dealing with his loss. David learned that Jake worked in an auto parts factory, had been saving for years to make this trip to London, and was using the journey as a way to honor his father's memory and to prove to himself that he could achieve something meaningful. David said, as they prepared to leave the cafe. "What happened today wasn't just meaningful for me. You turned what could have been a disrespectful tourist stunt into something that reminded everyone watching about the human dignity behind the uniform." Jake shook his head, almost ruined. "It by being so focused on getting a reaction for the crowd?" "But you didn't ruin it," David insisted. When it mattered, you chose respect over entertainment. You chose to see me as a person, rather than just a curiosity. As they stood outside the cafe, David pulled out a small notebook and pen. I'd like to keep in touch if that's all right. It's not often I meet someone who understands what I'm going through. Jake gave David his email address and phone number, still amazed that this connection had grown out of his morning's tourist activities. I'd like that too. And David, thank you for the pin. I'll treasure it. David smiled and shook Jake's hand. Again, thank you for reminding me why my job matters. And Jake, your father would be proud of the man you've become. The way you handled yourself today, the respect you showed, the kindness you offered to a stranger, that's his legacy living on through you. As Jake walked back to his hostel that evening, he realized that his trip to London had already given him something far more valuable than photographs or souvenirs. He had found a connection with someone who understood his grief and had helped him see that his father's influence was still guiding him in positive ways, even 2 years after his death. Jake's remaining days in London took on a completely different character after his encounter with David Thompson. What had started as a typical tourist trip focused on checking items off a sightseeing list had transformed into something much more meaningful and personal. Jake found himself approaching each new experience with the same respect and genuine curiosity that had turned his playful interaction with the Royal Guard into a life-changing connection. The next morning, Jake received an unexpected text message from David. Would you like to join me for lunch today? I'd love to show you some of London that most tourists never see. Jake immediately accepted the invitation, curious about what David had in mind. They met at Westminster Bridge, where David was waiting in casual clothes, looking relaxed and genuinely happy to see Jake again. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, David said as they walked along the Thames. You said you saved for 3 years to make this trip, working double shifts at a factory in Detroit. That kind of determination and sacrifice is impressive. Jake shrugged, still not entirely comfortable with compliments. I just wanted to honor my dad's memory by doing something he would have been proud of. Well, I think he would be proud, David replied. But I also think you should be proud of yourself. Not everyone would have had the discipline to save that money or the wisdom to turn a tourist stunt into a moment of genuine respect. David led Jake through a series of narrow streets and hidden alleys that didn't appear in any of Jake's guidebooks. They visited a small pub where David's grandfather used to meet with other veterans after the war, saw a memorial garden that honored ordinary citizens who had shown extraordinary courage during the London Blitz, and stopped at a bookshop where David often went to read and think about his father. These places tell the real story of London, David explained. Not the famous landmarks that everyone photographs, but the quiet spots where real people lived real lives and made real sacrifices. Jake was moved by the personal tour, but he was even more struck by the change in David's demeanor. The young man who had seemed so isolated and grief-stricken during their conversation at the cafe now appeared more confident and connected to his surroundings. You seem different today, Jake observed. More at peace, maybe. David smiled. Yesterday, when you reminded me why my job matters, it helped me remember something my father used to say. He told me that the best way to honor the dead is to live fully and to help others do the same. They stopped for lunch at a small restaurant near Covent Garden, where David introduced Jake to traditional British food that wasn't available at the tourist-focused establishments Jake had been frequenting. I have something to tell you, David said as they shared a shepherd's pie. What happened yesterday has started spreading among the other guards. Sergeant Williams told the story to several of the senior officers, and it's become something of a legend already. Jake looked concerned. I hope I didn't get you in trouble. Quite the opposite, David laughed. The story is being used as an example of how we can maintain our discipline and dignity while still connecting with the public in meaningful ways. Several of the younger guards have said it's helped them understand their role better. Jake was amazed to learn that their simple interaction had resonated with so many people. I never expected anything like that to happen, as more David continued. One of the officers suggested that your story should be shared more widely. There's a military publication that features stories about positive interactions between service members and civilians. They'd like to interview both of us about what happened. Jake felt overwhelmed by the idea that his tourist adventure could become an inspiring story for others. I don't know if I'm comfortable with that kind of attention. Understand, David said, but think about it. Your father's values, the respect he taught you, the way he influenced you to see service members as real people with real struggles. That message could help other people understand the humanity behind the uniform. That afternoon, David took Jake to visit the Imperial War Museum, where they spent hours looking at exhibits about ordinary people who had shown extraordinary courage during wartime. Jake was particularly moved by the personal stories of soldiers who had maintained their humanity and compassion even in the most difficult circumstances. These people face challenges that make our grief seem small, Jake observed, reading about a young soldier who had written letters home to comfort his parents even while enduring terrible conditions in the trenches. I don't think grief is ever small, David replied thoughtfully. But I do think these stories show us that pain can be transformed into something meaningful when we use it to connect with others and to honor those we've lost. As they walked through the museum, Jake began to understand that his interaction with David was part of a much larger story, about how people from different backgrounds and countries could find common ground through shared experiences of loss, respect, and hope. That evening, David invited Jake to meet some of his fellow guards at a pub near their barracks. Jake was nervous about the meeting, worried that the other guards might see him as the annoying tourist who had disrupted their colleague's duty. Instead, he found himself welcomed warmly by a group of young men who were curious about his story and grateful for the positive impact he had had on their friend. They shared their own stories about challenging moments during their service, times when interactions with the public had reminded them of their purpose or helped them through difficult periods. "What you did for David," said one guard named Michael. "It reminded all of us that we're not just standing there for show. We represent something important, something that connects us to the people we serve." Another guard, James, added, "Sometimes we get so focused on the discipline and the rules that we forget about the human element. Your story helped us remember that maintaining our dignity doesn't mean we can't acknowledge the humanity of the people around us." Jake left the pub that night feeling deeply moved by the connections he had made and the impact his simple gesture had apparently had on multiple people. What had started as a silly attempt to make a royal guard smile had somehow become a story about respect, grief, healing, and the unexpected ways that strangers can touch each other's lives. As he walked back to his hostel through the London streets, Jake realized that his father's influence was still shaping his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The values his dad had taught him about respect and service had guided him to turn a potentially embarrassing tourist moment into something meaningful, and that transformation was now rippling outward to affect other people's lives as well. Jake's last 3 days in London were filled with experiences he could never have imagined when he first planned his trip. David had become not just a friend, but a connection to a deeper understanding of what it meant to honor one's heritage, while building bridges across cultural differences. On his final morning in London, Jake returned to Buckingham Palace, but this time his visit had a completely different purpose. David had arranged for Jake to meet with Sergeant Williams and some of the senior officers to discuss the military publication article about their encounter. Jake arrived at the palace gates feeling nervous but determined. The interview was conducted in a small office building adjacent to the main palace, and Jake was surprised by how informal and welcoming the atmosphere was. Sergeant Williams introduced him to Captain Patricia Roberts, a veteran officer who would be conducting the interview. "For the military publication," Mr. Morrison, Captain Roberts said, "your story has become quite well known among our ranks. We'd like to understand what motivated you to transform what began as a typical tourist interaction into something much more meaningful," Jake thought carefully about his answer. "Honestly, Captain, it wasn't planned. I was just trying to have fun and entertain the crowd at first. But when I got close enough to really look at David Guard Thompson, I could see that he was a real person, with real feelings, not just a tourist attraction." "And what made you decide to leave your father's pin?" she asked. Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest when discussing his father. "My dad always taught me that when you meet someone who serves their country with honor, you show them respect. It didn't matter that David was British and I was American. Service is service, and sacrifice is sacrifice." Captain Roberts nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of understanding we hope to promote between our service members and the public, both domestically and internationally. After the interview, David walked Jake back through the palace grounds, showing him areas that were normally off-limits to tourists. "I have something for you," David said, stopping near a quiet garden area. "It's from all of the guards who heard your story." David handed Jake a beautifully crafted wooden box. Inside was a collection of small items: a photograph of the guard unit signed by all the members, a small piece of fabric from a ceremonial flag, and a handwritten letter from the entire unit expressing their gratitude for the positive impact Jake's story had made on their morale and sense of purpose. "We wanted you to have something that represents all of us," David explained. "Your story reminded us that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, something that connects us to people all over the world who understand honor and respect." Jake was deeply moved as he read the letter, which was written in beautiful calligraphy and expressed sentiments that went far beyond what he felt he deserved. "I don't know what to say. This is incredible." "There's something else," David continued. "The story about our meeting is going to be published not just in the military journal, but also in a magazine that goes out to veterans organizations in America. Your father's influence on your character is going to inspire other people who have lost loved ones in service." Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes. The idea that his father's teachings could somehow help other grieving families was more meaningful than anything he could have imagined when he boarded that plane from Detroit. That afternoon, Jake and David spent their final hours together visiting the Churchill War Rooms, where they talked about leadership, sacrifice, and the way ordinary people can rise to meet extraordinary challenges. Jake found himself thinking not just about his father, but about all the people throughout history who had served something larger than themselves. Jake said, as they sat in the museum cafe. "When I planned this trip, I thought I was just going to take some photos and see some famous buildings. I never expected to find a friend or two, learn so much about myself." David smiled. "That's the thing about meaningful connections. They usually happen when we're not looking for them. You came here to honor your father's memory, and you ended up creating new memories that honor his values." As evening approached, Jake realized he needed to return to his hostel to pack for his flight the next morning. The two men exchanged contact, information, and promised to stay in touch. But they both knew that their friendship had already changed them both in permanent ways. "Jake," David said as they prepared to part ways, "I want you to know that meeting you has helped me heal from my father's death in ways I didn't think were possible. You reminded me that grief doesn't have to make us isolated. It can actually help us connect more deeply with other people who understand loss." Jake hugged his new friend, something that would have seemed impossible when David was standing at rigid attention outside Buckingham Palace just a few days earlier. "You helped me too, David. You showed me that my father's influence is still alive in the way I treat other people." 6 months later, Jake was back at work in the auto parts factory in Detroit when he received an email from David with an attachment. It was the published article about their meeting, which had appeared in both the military journal and the veterans magazine. The article was titled, "When Tourists and Guards Connect: A Story of Respect Across Borders." Jake read the article with amazement, hardly believing that their simple interaction had been transformed into an inspiring story that was now reaching thousands of readers. The article emphasized themes of international friendship, the importance of seeing service members as individuals rather than symbols, the way that personal grief could be transformed into meaningful connections with others. But the biggest surprise came in the final paragraph, where the article mentioned that their story had inspired a new training program for Royal Guards about positive public engagement, and had also been shared with military units in several other countries as an example of how service members could maintain their dignity while still connecting with civilians in meaningful ways. Jake immediately called David, who was equally excited about the article's publication and its unexpected impact. "The best part," David told Jake over the phone, "is that our story has encouraged other guards to share their own experiences of meaningful interactions with the public. It's created a whole culture of openness and connection that didn't exist before." Jake smiled as he looked at the framed photo of himself and David that now sat on his desk at the factory. Next to it were the two pins, his father's American flag and David's Queen's Guard insignia, serving as daily reminders that respect, kindness, and genuine human connection could transform even the most unlikely encounters into something beautiful and lasting. You know what I think my dad would say about all this? Jake asked David. What's that? He'd say that the best way to honor the dead is to live in a way that creates more kindness in the world. I think that's exactly what we did. As Jake hung up the phone and returned to his work, he realized that his trip to London had given him something far more valuable than memories or souvenirs. It had shown him that his father's values were still guiding him toward meaningful connections and positive impact, even in the most unexpected circumstances. The silly tourist who had tried to make a royal guard smile had accidentally discovered that the most powerful human interactions happen when we choose respect over entertainment, understanding over judgment, and connection over separation.